When you search Che Guevara on YouTube, you'll be greeted with an overwhelming amount of videos calling him a murderer, psychopath, homophobe, racist, and so on.
You're wearing a mass murderer's t-shirt.
He personally murdered or had murdered thousands of Cuban citizens.
It's like walking around, again, with a Stalin t-shirt.
There exists very few well-thought-out rebuttals to these claims on this website. The videos on the screen right now are really good in my opinion, but they're unfortunately drowned out by the slander. I get a lot of comments from people who are curious as to why I keep a portrait of a supposed tyrannical mass-murdering bigot in my living room, especially since I emphasize democracy so much in my videos, and that's because he's not a mass murderer. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single verifiable instance of him killing even one innocent person. The lack of knowledge when it comes to Che Guevara is evident. There are countless YouTube historians who can't even get the dude's birthday right, yet somehow feel the need to fill you in on the truth about Che Guevara.
Ernesto Che Guevara was born June 14, 1928 in Rosario, Argentina.
Yes, although Wikipedia will tell you that his birthday was June 14th, his actual birthday was a month earlier, on May 14th. We know this because the most acclaimed biography on Che, written by John Lee Anderson, explains how Che's own mother admitted this fact to an astrologer on the literal first page of the book. If you're gonna make a truth about Che Guevara video, don't you think you should at least skim what is considered to be one of the most significant pieces written about the man? I don't bring this up to be pedantic. Anderson is such an important journalist on the topic of Guevara that he is credited with literally helping to find Che's remains after 30 years. He might be worth the read. This may seem like a small detail I'm obsessing over, but it's emblematic of the greater lack of respect for this topic. So, in this video, I'll take the 3 big accusations levied against Guevara, that he was a mass murderer, racist, and a homophobe, and refute each claim. Was Che Guevara a murderer? Well, the good folks over at PragerU sure seem to think so. They also like to draw Che as though he was a brown person for some reason, even though he was a white dude with Irish and Spanish ancestry. I guess drawing the guy with a darker complexion while trying to paint him as a terrorist plays well with their conservative base. Anyway, for those unfamiliar with Guevara's story, he was born into a well-off family in Argentina with a bad case of asthma. He was very bright and he studied to become a doctor. When he was in his early 20s, he and his friend decided to go on a trip from Argentina all the way up to North America so they could experience the world around them. On this trip, Che saw the immense suffering and poverty in Latin America, and he understood the culprit to be US corporations and imperialism that looted the lands and marginalized the indigenous peoples. He even witnessed the US-led overthrow of democratically elected Guatemalan president Jacobo Arbenz because American corporations wanted to continue expropriating Guatemalan land and fruit. This trip radicalized Che and ultimately led to his involvement in the overthrow of the US-backed Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. Che played a pivotal role in the Cuban Revolution alongside Fidel Castro and the rest of his rebel army. Now, before I go any further, this video is not about Fidel. A lot of people like to conflate the two men when discussing Che's record and argue that since they perceive Fidel to be a terrible, evil man, then it must follow that Che was too. Apart from the fact that Fidel's story is nuanced and shouldn't be touched on as a side note, Che and Fidel were very different people. Fidel wasn't even a communist at the time of the revolution. He actually stacked his new government with relatively conservative people in the attempt to placate the hostile USA. Yes, many mistakes were made by Fidel in the years that followed the revolution, and yes, a lot of them were in response to the US invasion, bombing, and embargo of his country. But for the sake of brevity, this video will focus on Che. Similarly, there are bad faith actors who like to conflate Che with the Cuban state itself and attribute any wrongdoing committed by the state to Che. Every country has its own flawed history in some way. We're not going to blame Guevara for Cuba's unless he was directly involved. Back to this very well done and totally not dishonest PragerU video. As you can see, they are kind enough to link us to a source document which I happily clicked through in the hopes of finding some new and damning information on Che. As I dealt with the source material and tried to trace the claims back to their original sources, it did not take me long before I arrived at cubaarchive.org. If you've ever had a conversation with someone set on convincing you that Che was a mass murderer, they might have told you to check out this site. I know a lot of op-eds on the topic like to use Cuba Archive as a source, like this HuffPost article. Researchers have documented 216 victims of Che Guevara in Cuba from 1957 to 1959. Wow, I gotta check this out. Oh nice, an Error 404 page. That's some good-ass journalism right there. In almost every slanderous article or blog post I read on the topic of Guevara, any definitive claim that Che killed X amount of people would redirect me to Cuba Archive, specifically this 404 error page. Now, this is obviously a dead end. The page was taken down for some reason, probably due to blatant dishonesty, but as I researched this topic further, I'm almost certain that this page is the one being debunked in a 4-year-old video by a YouTuber called Bad Empanada, where he goes in depth on the topic and does a really good job highlighting how dishonest Cuba Archive can be. I definitely recommend you check it out if you want more on this topic. As of 2025, Cuba Archive is still home to a database that lists the names and cases of people who died or disappeared under both Batista and Castro's rule, which on its face seems like a useful tool that could help us to further understand the severity of the issue at hand, until we very quickly see that this database is filled with dishonesty and misappropriations of their very own source material. Not to mention, citing Cuba Archive, a database that covers deaths and disappearances committed by the Cuban state since 1952, doesn't necessarily fill you in on whether or not Che Guevara was the culprit. But to illustrate my point about the misinformation prevalent on this website, let's look at the case of a man who we know for certain Che personally killed because he wrote about it in his diaries. Killed, not murdered. There is a difference, and it's an important one, and we'll get into the distinction in a bit. This is a case that is often used when trying to paint Che as a mass murderer because it's the one instance of a killing that we can actually confirm with a primary source. Che Guevara, Cuba Archive states, was a peasant and rebel army member executed on charges of being a Batista government informant by Che himself. And the source they quote for this is, oh, would you look at that? It's John Lee Anderson's biography. Well, luckily for us, we have a copy of Anderson's book, so we can get that much-needed context directly from the source. Che Guevara was in fact a peasant who joined the rebel army to fight against Batista, but he betrayed the rebels and collaborated with the enemy. This led to the rebel army's location being compromised and bombed, and it even led to the death of a rebel guerrilla. It's important to note that treason and betrayal was known to bring a death sentence. That much was made clear before joining the rebels. When Eutimio was captured by the rebels, they found an army-safe conduct pass bearing his name and proving he collaborated with the enemy. Eutimio didn't even try to ask for clemency because he was well aware of his crimes and he knew that the punishment for treachery was death. Eutimio got down on his knees, asking that he be shot to have it over with. Now, instead of just brazenly executing him on the spot the way a mass murderer would have no problem doing, Che and the rebels conducted a makeshift trial for Eutimio. They were in the middle of a guerrilla war, so they had to make do with what they could, but he was given a trial nonetheless. Even Cuba Archive nonchalantly admits this. Fidel ultimately gave the order to execute the man who betrayed the army and led to the death of a fellow rebel, and Che, only after seeing that nobody else wanted to carry out the execution, did so. Now you tell me if that constitutes murder. Murder is a legal term encompassing the unlawful killing of an innocent person. This is obviously a tragic story, but murder is not the appropriate word to use. Otherwise, we would have to turn to other nations like the US, who also consider treason to be punishable by death, and consider that practice to be murderous as well. It's very clear that a lot of nuance is stripped away from this case if you just read the Cuba Archive page on it. Like I said, Che's detractors like to publicize the story of Eutimio Guevara because it's the only confirmed case of Che personally killing someone. Like this hit piece written by Alvaro Vargas Llosa that reads, "Guevara shot Eutimio Guevara because he suspected him of passing on information." We can see that the author is using vague language here to make Che seem unreasonable. Llosa leaves out the fact that the rebels found an army-safe conduct pass proving definitively that Eutimio was guilty. Little tricks like this are played all over Cuba Archive's database as well. To really drive this home, Guevara betrayed the rebels, colluded with the enemy in a way that led to the death of a rebel guerrilla, was captured, admitted his wrongdoings, asked for death, was given a trial, and was executed for treason. This is not some act of sadistic depravity that Che took pleasure in carrying out. Cuba Archive will touch on similar cases where the rebels, sometimes acting on Che's command, were forced to carry out similar executions of traitors, criminals, and Batista collaborators, and although Cuba Archive uses very ambiguous language describing what happened, I implore you to actually seek out the source material that they use, and you will quickly realize that they often bastardize their own sources to make it seem as though Che was walking around murdering innocent people. His victims, if you could even call them that, were often murderers and torturers of peasants, enemy combatants, or traitors who collaborated with the enemy and compromised the rebels, which would bring a death sentence in the US as well. It's sad to see Che's detractors hyper-focus on such shoddy evidence regarding his supposed mass murder sprees when We have verifiable instances of his work in establishing hospitals, administering medical aid to people, teaching people how to read and write in the effort to combat illiteracy, being an outspoken critic of horrific regimes like that of apartheid South Africa, which we'll get into later in this video when discussing his supposed racism, and more. But for now, let's move on to the main point of contention for those who paint Che as a mass murderer: his work overseeing the Cuban tribunals after the Batista regime fell. After the revolution was won and the dictator Fulgencio Batista fled the country, a lot of Batista's army men, police, and collaborators remained in Cuba, and like any other war criminals, needed to be tried in tribunals. It's important to note that Batista's rule was genuinely brutal. His forces were guilty of acts so depraved that I can't even mention them in this video. He treated the Cuban population horrendously, with atrocities ranging from torture to mutilation to mass murder. CIA records confirm this and, surprisingly, juxtapose Batista's tyrannical rule with Castro's comparatively sensible one. Quote, "The large-scale campaigns of murders and terrorism characteristic of the last years of the Batista regime have not occurred during the Castro regime." Again, this is not me playing defense for any atrocities that may have occurred under Castro. It just feels like it would be relevant to share what the CIA was saying at the time. It is funny how Cuba had an actual mass-murdering despot at its helm for so many years, yet conservative media rarely brings it up. Castro put Che in charge of trying the war criminals, rapists, murderers, and torturers from the Batista regime. This entailed Che going over their cases and issuing a sentence. This could be compared to any other tribunal. In Che's case, suspected war criminals were brought to La Cabana, a fortress he used as a headquarters and military prison. Those suspected of atrocities, often involving the torture of peasants, sexual abuses, and murders, had their cases looked over by Che and other members tasked with presiding over the tribunals. His work at this fortress has earned Che the nickname, the Butcher of La Cabana, by those who like to misrepresent his legacy and paint him as a careless mass murderer who killed everyone who was brought to him. But the historical record begs to differ. Orlando Borrego, the accountant who administered La Cabana's finances and fellow tribunal president, had this to say about the trials. "Our paramount concern was to ensure that revolutionary morality and justice prevailed. Che was very careful. Nobody was shot for hitting a prisoner, but if there was extreme torture and killings and death, then yes, they were condemned to death. The whole case was analyzed, all the witnesses seen, and the relatives of the dead or tortured person came, or the tortured person himself." In addition to this, Anderson reports that Che never attended the trials or met with defendants himself as to not jeopardize the legal process and intertwine personal vendettas with justice. He just went over the cases with his fellow judges and reached a verdict on the basis of evidence alone. Borrego also mentioned that Che took great care in selecting the judges and prosecutors, and that the rebels who were mistreated were not allowed to pass judgment on their former torturers. He went on to talk about how there were people and prosecutors who would superfluously ask for the death sentence, but they would be frequently moderated by Che and his colleagues. So yes, there were trials and executions during this period in Cuba, but according to John Lee Anderson, these trials were above-board, if summary affairs with defense lawyers, witnesses, prosecutors, and an attending public. But there was also a number of arbitrary executions. The most notorious incident occurred when, soon after occupying Santiago, Raul Castro directed a mass execution of more than 70 captured soldiers. Raul's reputation for ruthlessness was confirmed. Now, those with a keen eye might be able to pick up on the fact that Raul Castro is actually not Che Guevara. Those are different people. Anderson goes on to say there was little overt public oppositions to the workings of revolutionary justice. On the contrary, Batista's thugs had committed some sickening crimes, and the Cuban public was in a lynching mood. Che warned his judges to be scrupulous about weighing the evidence in each case so as not to give the revolution's enemies additional ammunition, but the trials had to continue if Cuba's revolution was to be secure. In a book by Paco Ignacio Taibo called Guevara, also known as Che, Taibo says this about the trials. Without a doubt, Che was in favor of the summary trials, but the tales woven by Cuban exiles in which he was the Butcher of La Cabana presiding over most of the shootings in Havana are flights of fantasy. Revolutionary Tribunals number 1 and number 2 did sit at La Cabana, the first trying policemen and soldiers, the second, which did not pass death sentences, trying civilians. I really want to emphasize that. The tribunals tasked with dishing out civilian sentences did not condemn non-combatants to death.
Che sent many people, even the innocent, to their deaths.
Now, before you accuse me of using evil Marxist sources, Taibo's book was cited as a source on that Cuba archive entry on Guerrero that we covered earlier. I'm using the same sources used by a website dead set on framing Che as the devil. To add to this, in a forum with PBS, John Lee Anderson said, "I have yet to find a single credible source pointing to the case where Che executed an innocent. Those persons executed by Guevara or on his orders were condemned for the usual crimes punishable by death at times of war or in its aftermath: desertion, treason, or crimes such as rape, torture, or murder." I should add that my research spanned 5 years and included anti-Castro Cubans among the Cuban-American exile community in Miami and elsewhere. From what we can tell, Che was far from a careless murderer. He actually seemed to be very cognizant and fair. This is not to say that he was a perfect man who did everything right with no room for improvement. I'm not trying to glaze too close to the sun, but these were incredibly stressful and unique conditions, and the evidence supporting the claim that Che was a ruthless and bloodthirsty murderer is weak. Was Che racist? Another claim that is often levied against Che is that he was a bigot. This is often used as a gotcha by conservatives who like to point out what they perceive to be the hypocrisy of left-leaning people celebrating a supposed bigot. It usually goes like this. Hey, left-wing college kid, you claim to dislike racism and homophobia, but you wear a t-shirt with the image of a racist homophobe on it. I, on the other hand, don't dislike racism or homophobia. I'm quite fond of both, but despite that, I still don't wear a t-shirt with Che Guevara on it because he cared too much for the poor, and that grosses me out. Anyway, my pregnant wife is not going to yell at herself. Gotta go. In all seriousness, there are some accusations of bigotry that can be fairly levied at Che, so let's take a closer look. Starting with the accusation that he was a racist. There are many fake quotes that are wrongfully attributed to Che in the attempt to paint him as a racist, one of which goes, "We're going to do for black people exactly what they did for the revolution," by which I mean nothing. This quote, while damning and definitely racist, can't be definitively traced back to Guevara. It's circulated heavily by Cuban-American conservatives like Humberto Fontava, holy fuck, I killed that pronunciation, I think, who regularly spews outright falsehoods like Che helped to herd gay people into forced labor camps, which we will debunk later in this video. And Fontava is the source of this banger of a quote: "The lily-white Che Guevara and Fidel Castro overthrew the mixed-raced Batista." Is bro trying to imply that Batista's mass murder campaigns were okay because he was mixed race? What kind of identity politics bullshit is this? I refer you back to the CIA document about Batista's brutality. Also, I have a hard time believing that Fontava gives any semblance of a fuck about racism considering he collaborated with Bill O'Reilly, who made a litany of unsavory comments regarding race. Fontava also authored a book about Che, and it's genuinely insane. It's just a really bitter, incoherent polemic that author Rolf Potts referred to as slightly schizophrenic. The Fox article from which I pulled these Fontava quotes also can't make up its mind on whether or not Che was a racist. Right here it says, "Many of the people Che was sending to the firing squad were members of Batista's army, and these disproportionately tended to be black and mixed race. Batista himself was mixed race." And then literally 3 lines later it says, "Guevara also at times, however, called for more black people to be represented in institutions and had black fighters under his command." What are we doing here, guys? However, there is a genuinely racist quote that was written by Che, and it is worth talking about. Remember how I mentioned that Che was born in a well-off white family in Argentina and had a sheltered and privileged upbringing? Well, this upbringing came with blind spots. When he was a young man in his early 20s traveling around South America on his motorbike, he kept a personal diary, which is now a famous book called The Motorcycle Diaries. In this book, he wrote a horrific and inexcusably racist passage about black people. It goes like this: "The blacks, those magnificent examples of the African race who have maintained their racial purity thanks to their lack of an affinity with bathing, have seen their territory invaded by a new kind of slave, the Portuguese, and the 2 ancient races have now begun a hard life together, fraught with bickering and squabbles. Discrimination and poverty unite them in the daily fight for survival, but their different ways of approaching life separate them completely. The black is indolent and a dreamer, spending his meager wage on frivolity or drink. The European has a tradition of work and saving, which has pursued him as far as this corner of America, and drives him to advance himself. Jesus Christ, yes, this is really bad and indefensible. And the man Che grew to be and the man Che was when he wrote this are very different. In order to fully grasp the context of this quote, we need to understand that this was written by a spoiled rich kid who had been largely sheltered from any form of intersectional analysis and was extremely racially insensitive. This is a quote from the beginning of his journey, and if you actually read the book, you can see this young 24-year-old grow into a very different man. He met with many indigenous people during his journey and noted how much better he was treated as a white man compared to them. At the end of his journey, he notes that he is no longer the person he was when he embarked on this trip. Quote, "The person who wrote these notes passed away the moment his feet touched Argentine soil again. The person who reorganizes and polishes them, me, is no longer. At least, I am not the person I once was. All this wandering around our great America with a capital A has changed me more than I thought." Clearly a story of growth and self-improvement, yet people like Marco Rubio feel the need to embellish and push a narrative that just isn't true. No, Marco Rubio, Che Guevara did not write extensively about the superiority of white Europeans. In fact, Che's efforts to remedy his disgraceful writings are impressive. In a 1959 letter to William Morris in Miami, Florida, Che Guevara writes, "Esteemed sir, I received your letter to pass on to our commander-in-chief, which I have done, but I would like to say that if any vestiges of racial discrimination remain in this country, our revolution will put a complete end to them. You can be absolutely sure that within a few years, any difference between white and black will be solely a question of skin color, as it should be." It's important to note that the US in 1959 was racist as hell. The Civil Rights Bill had not even passed yet, and the president who ended up passing it, LBJ, referred to it as the N-word bill, but that's a different story. Che was also loudly against apartheid in South Africa, and he even gave a now famous speech on this topic at the UN, where he said, "Once again, we speak out to put the world on guard against what is happening in South Africa. The brutal policy of apartheid is applied before the eyes of the nations of the world. The peoples of Africa are compelled to endure the fact that on the African continent, the superiority of one race over another remains official policy, and that in the name of this racial superiority, murder is committed with impunity. Can the United Nations do nothing to stop this?" He then, in the same speech, went on to detail the crisis inflicted upon the people of Congo and the role of imperialism in the appropriation of their land and resources. He actually cared so much about Congo that he left his post in Cuba, relinquished his Cuban citizenship and all creature comforts that came with it, so he could personally go to the DRC and try to spur revolution. This is not just some guy who overthrew a dictator and then bathed in the glory and lived a comfortable hedonistic life. For a guy who supposedly wrote extensively about the superiority of white people, as Marco Rubio claims, everything he wrote and did as an adult seems to directly contradict that claim. Was Che homophobic? Similarly to his distasteful comments in regards to race, a young Che Guevara could also be quoted making a definitely homophobic remark about a gay person. He referred to a man as a pervert and then followed up the quote by saying, "Apart from being a homosexual, he had been very nice to us." Yeah, really bad, indefensible, and just like his racist remarks that we touched on earlier, he said this as a young, sheltered, rich kid in the 1950s, and then he grew up. But see, if the conversation started and ended there, I would have no problem conceding the point that Che had said some homophobic shit. He is, after all, just a man, but that's not what his detractors do. They go on to say that he rounded up gay people and forced them into concentration camps after the Cuban Revolution. Some dishonest actors go as far as to claim that he murdered people for being gay.
Che Guevara executed gays, right? This is a guy, if when you wear a Che Guevara shirt, you're wearing a Hitler who was less successful in being charismatic and duping people.
Now, this is just blatantly untrue. There is no verifiable record of Che killing people for their sexuality. What is often being referred to when people make this point is the UMAP system in Cuba. The UMAPs were military units to aid production, and people who opted out of military service had to serve their country in a different way, and they were sent to these forced labor camps. At the time, gay people were not allowed to serve in the Cuban military, the same way they weren't allowed to serve in any other country's military, and they were subjected to forced labor in these Cuban camps. It is worth noting that draft dodgers in the US were sent to prison, where the 13th Amendment turned them into literal slaves but that's another story. Yes, the UMAPs were despicable and unjustifiable. No, just because the Americans did similar shit does not make it okay. There are also reports of gay people being mistreated and abused in these camps. It undoubtedly was really inexcusably bad, considering Fidel Castro felt the need to issue an apology for this dark period in Cuban history, saying, "If anyone is responsible, it's me." The dreaded UMAP system ran from November 1965 to July of 1968. 3 years too long, if you ask me. But again, this video is not about the Cuban state. It's about Che Guevara. So what was he doing during this time? Oh yeah, he was in Congo. In April of 1965, Che relinquished his Cuban citizenship and left the country to spread revolution abroad. He left Cuba 3 months before the UMAPs were established. In a farewell letter to Fidel, written by Che on April 1st, 1965, he says, "I formally resign my positions in the leadership of the party, my post as minister, my rank of commander, and my Cuban citizenship. Nothing legally binds me to Cuba. The only ties are of another nature, those that cannot be broken, as can appointments to posts." Che died 2 years after writing this in 1967, and the UMAPs ended in 1968. During their runtime, Che was in Congo, and then Bolivia, and then he was killed. He had nothing to do with them. Now, could Che have done more to stick up for LGBT rights in Cuba, especially during a period of machismo and ignorance towards gay people? Yeah, I'm sure he could have, and that would have been cool as fuck. But again, this was the 1960s. That doesn't make it right. Homophobia was never right, but apart from a single homophobic passage written when he was in his early 20s, he was 24, Che was not this raging homophobe who rounded up gay people and threw them into camps or killed them. That just isn't true. In summary, in his youth, Che wrote racist and homophobic things. We know he grew out of his racism, as his later actions showed. We can't say for certain whether or not he grew out of his homophobia, but we could infer that as he matured and became a Marxist, he rid himself of these bigoted ideas and focused on solidarity. There are no actions or writings from his adult life that suggest that he was a horrific homophobe, but without new evidence, we'll never know for sure. It's not uncommon to meet people who hate Che and the Cuban government for anecdotal reasons. I have people close to me who lived in Cuba under Fidel and they really loved him, but that's why we don't use anecdotes and we stick to empiricism. History is not made up of great, infallible people. It's made up of people reacting to their environments and material realities. There's no such thing as a perfect person, but I agree with Jean-Paul Sartre when he said that Che Guevara was the most complete human being of our age.